Welcome to our presentation on intercultural communication and COVID-19. So for an introduction, intercultural communication has been around since civilization's dawn. Intercultural communication is more than what you think. For example, ancient nations fighting each other, like the Romans and the Carthaginians, is intercultural communication. Just a bit pointy by today's standards. Although, yeah, that's a bit extreme. Post 1945, the world has seen prosperity never before known. This has led to increased communication among those that differ, a sharing of ideas, beliefs, and ideologies. So when COVID-19 began its global onslaught, some folks with differences united to combat a common foe. Others, meanwhile, placed blame on those that did not deserve it. Today, we'll show some insight into a prelude of what occurred and the struggles faced by global cultures in the pandemic. So here we have an interesting chart showing the correlation of internet activity involving a particular disease and actual cases of the disease. Ebola, flu, Twitter. Responses to pandemics always involve xenophobia. People are positional, and if they have lived with a narrow worldview, they will express it. We must broaden our horizons, as one might say. The continued use of stigmatizing terms like Spanish flu, Mexican swine flu, and Ebola virus can be psychologically harmful and indicate how authorities and the public react to an epidemic despite the World Health Organization's attempts to dissuade using certain peoples, places, or animals to name infectious diseases. For example, a person who knows nothing of pandemics could associate the Spanish flu with Spain and Spaniards, leading to people in their culture likely having a negative view of Spaniards for no real reason, although they do have an interesting past. According to Tiffany 2020, scholars argue that promoting an association between foreigners and a particular epidemic can be a rhetorical strategy for promoting fear, or alternatively, imparting a sense of safety to the public. For instance, most of the American media coverage of the COVID-19 outbreak has been characterized by a proliferation of sensationalized, inaccurate, and xenophobic headlines. So here we see some statistics on those most affected. Asian members of Western society became increased subjects of hate, due mainly to the fact that the disease originated in Wuhan, China, and this of course translated into the workplace. An April 2020 survey resulted in 32% of those interviewed saying they had witnessed someone blaming Asians for the pandemic, while 60% of Asian respondents had witnessed similar blame. Americans of Asian descent were far more likely than those not of Asian descent to have experienced the following: folks acting discomforted when in proximity to them, 39%, subject to slurs and or jokes, 31%, feared threats and or physical safety, 26%. This was due to race and since the beginning of the pandemic. So now we dive into the workplace. How did this negative intercultural communication involve the workplace? We all know that discouraged people do poor work, and if someone made a negative remark about you at the day's beginning, your productivity levels wouldn't be the same as if no such statement was made. Negative intercultural communication in the workplace became more prevalent during COVID-19 worldwide. According to CNN Business, Asians around the world appear to be experiencing more discrimination, and many of them say it's happening at work. In October 2020, 66.4% of Asian Australians polled expressed they had been subjected to workplace discrimination, a 15% increase in 6 months. These findings coincided with the fact that COVID-19 worsened considerably in Australia during this time. In the spring of 2020, Asian Australians saw over twice the drop in work hours on average than the rest of the population. So here we have a pie chart showing how 1 in 3 Asian Health Center respondents have felt discrimination since the pandemic. So here we continue with the workplace. How would this translate? Less hours equals less money in pocket, leading to a poorer demographic. If one was given less hours, they might not feel included in their work family as well, meaning decreased social well-being and productivity. Chinese members of the UK workforce saw increased work loss as the pandemic ravaged the economy. The employment rate of the Chinese demographic dropped from 4.6% from first to second quarter of 2020. This drop was nearly 3 times more than declines experienced by other ethnic groups. Now, if you look at this chart here, we have a bar chart showing the perceived increase in harassment or attacks on the basis of race, ethnicity, or skin color in neighborhood since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada, and this includes visible minorities. So at the top, we can see those of Asian descent, or Chinese, Korean, Southeast Asian, that from that part of the world, they saw the highest level of negative interaction, which is not very unfortunate. So how did different cultures and different attitudes lead to some confusion in the COVID-19 pandemic? Different cultures have a different reaction to the same news. In Canada, for example, many complied with masks, but in the land of the free, many wouldn't accept such mandates. It was found at the pandemic's start, while Americans had the lowest likelihood to abide by COVID-19 public health rules, Europeans had the least awareness of the condition and the least propensity to care about it. COVID-19 was widely known throughout the Middle East and Asia. When compared to those on other continents like Europe, Africa, and North America, individuals in the Middle East were the ones most afraid of the coronavirus. With different cultures taking things differently, this leads to increased conflict and an us versus them feeling, possibly leading to a more nationalist government, and many frequent debates occurred from quite often on Facebook from people with different backgrounds. So here are some possible solutions. Such blatant discrimination could have been combated. Ad campaigns highlighting the hardships being faced by minorities could have been ran at increased levels. Most importantly, some would have benefited from a history lesson. Diseases are a natural occurrence that spring up all over. The Spanish flu and AIDS both originated in the USA. Also, disease outbreak depends on population, hygiene, level of development. It is truly no one's fault. Why is this disease noteworthy? To better the future, we must acknowledge our past. We can learn from these societal mistakes, create awareness about how the affected feel. We have made bounds in recognizing equality in the past 500 years, but we still have a long way to go.
In this section of the PowerPoint, I'll be discussing the impact COVID-19 had on the 2020 presidential election. As most of us knew at the time, the 2020 presidential election was never going to be a complete walk in the park to begin with for Donald Trump, especially seeing as he was already president at the time in hopes of getting reelected, but he was dealing with a lot of ongoing issues in the country at the time. Ultimately, COVID had beaten the former president in the election while he was relying on peace and prosperity to win it for him. Regardless of the efforts to fight COVID by implementing lockdowns, which basically implied no large public gatherings, Trump clearly was not successful in the 2020 election. Two weeks prior to the election, there was a survey study that had been conducted regarding who the survey respondents were supporting in the upcoming election. This study shows a great deal of how the pandemic worked against Trump. With COVID continuing to spread and the country still without a vaccine, the economy is hitting a large downturn as unemployment rates continued growing as businesses are being shut down. As you can see here, to measure issue concerns, this is the data collected from the people who were surveyed regarding the election. And they were also asked to list their top 3 most concerning issues in the country today. This list consisted of 12 factors that affect voting behavior for the survey respondents to list their top 3. According to this set of data, the top 5 most concerning issues that Americans were dealing with during the time of the 2020 presidential election was COVID-19, the economy, healthcare, racism, and immigration. In this slide, you can see Trump's approval rankings regarding the same 12 issues that were taken from survey respondents. This survey data shows that with the pandemic coming into play as a most important issue in the country and the economy being in a deep recession doesn't exactly give Trump a fair-fought election. With that being said, imagine Joe Biden was running for re-election during the 2020 presidential election, and he was the president during the time of the pandemic announcement. People most likely would look elsewhere to vote for the new president because of how negatively COVID-19 affected the economy. In this final slide, I'll be discussing how intercultural communication played a part in the 2020 presidential election. As most of us already know, intercultural communication is communication between people with differing cultural identities. Back in 2016, following the presidential election when Donald Trump won, there was an increase in the number of hate crimes and online harassments targeting minorities on the days and in the cities where Donald Trump would campaign. We believe that one answer to all of this would be that there has been a shift in social norms regarding the acceptance of racist attitudes due to Donald Trump winning the election. This gives Donald Trump a terrible look in many people's eyes, and rightfully so. Donald Trump's inability to make peace with people of different cultural identities makes for a hard-ran election against his competitors. In conclusion, COVID-19 and intercultural communication had a substantial impact on Donald Trump's chances of re-election during the 2020 presidential election.